Okay guys, the next section on your homework talks about imaginary numbers. So all this means is that an imaginary number is a number that doesn't exist, okay? And it always represents the square root of -1. So anytime we get a square root with an answer and with a negative on the inside, we can pull the negative square root of 1 out and call it an I. So that's I, that's I. This is all the different ways you can write an I, okay? Given that I is the square root of -1, you can conclude that I squared will be a -1. This means that the square of any imaginary number is a negative real number. When squaring an imaginary number, use the power of a product property of exponents. So you distribute. Find the square of the imaginary number. What is 5i squared? So all we do is you distribute the square root of both numbers. So we get 5 squared and I squared. 5 squared is 25. I squared is -1, so it's -25. So it is possible to square something and end up with a negative if there's an I involved. Okay, -I square root of 2. So we have to square both parts. So they're going to square the I, and they're squaring the square root of 2. You could leave the negative in there if you wanted to. A negative and negative is going to turn to a positive anyways. Square root of 2 squared is 2. So we end up with 2 times -1, which is a -2. Find the square of the imaginary number. So we're just going to square, which is -2 squared times I squared. -2 squared is 4. I squared is -1. So we end up with -4. We're going to take the square root of 3 squared over 3 squared times I squared. So square root of 3 times the square root of 3 is a 3. 3 squared is 9. I squared is -1. This reduces to 1/3. So we end up with 1/3 times -1. We end up with an answer of -1/3. The last part of this, finding imaginary solutions of simple quadratics. So this is exactly like what we did before, except we're going to end up with a negative number inside. So all we're going to do is we're going to pull the -1 out as an I and solve the rest of it. So let's look at this. We're given an equation we're just going to solve. So we subtract 11 from both sides. We end up with 4x squared equals -5. Divide both sides by 4, and we end up with a -5/4. We square root both sides. So I have a square root of -1 times 5 over the square root of 4. So this comes out as I. We can't simplify that down. This turns into a positive or -2. Okay? So we end up with I square root of 5 over 2. Is our answer. They divided both sides by 4. Last two problems, all we're doing is solving. -9, 1/4 x squared equals -9. Divide by 1/4. We get x squared equals -36. Square root. X equals -1 times 6 times 6. So the 6 pulls out as a 6. That pulls out as an I. There's nothing left inside. So I end up with 6i as my answer. Last one, number 12. Solving for x, subtract 3, -5x equals -3. Divide by -5, that's a squared. We get x squared equals a +3/5. There's not going to be an imaginary number because it is all positive. So we take the square root. X equals positive or negative. Square root of 3 over the square root of 5. We have to rationalize the denominator. So x equals positive or negative square root of 15 over 5. This one should have been a positive or negative. This blank forgot that. And that is your notes for 4-1.